For this evening's sermon, I want to just go ahead and jump right in to reading some scripture. And I'm going to try to cover three main points, three things for us to think about throughout this week. And so we're just going to go ahead and jump right into it. And I want to turn to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4. And beginning in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice in so far as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome to those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. The next passage I want to read is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. And third passage in 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing and his kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. These three, perhaps somewhat disjointed sections of Scripture are things that I want to focus on this evening. I want us to remember and to be aware that as we seek to follow God, there will be times in our lives where we will suffer because of that decision. There will be times in our lives, whether the suffering is great or small, where we will be outcasts from the society that we find ourselves living in. There will be times in which people will mock us, will make fun of us, will belittle us, will persecute us because of our faith. Peter tells us to be glad when we face those situations. As we look at 1 Corinthians, we are told that we need to be careful when we think we are doing well in case we fall, because temptation is there. But he gives us the advice, gives us the encouragement to know that when temptation is there, there is also a way to escape it. And then finally, we see in 2 Timothy, Paul telling Timothy to be prepared in season and out of season, to preach and to teach and to guide those who need to know more about Christ. Again, 3 separate, somewhat disjointed points that I'm going to try to tie together as we look at the story of Joseph, at least large sections of it. We will be in Genesis for the remainder of tonight's lesson, and we will be looking at Joseph and the story of Joseph, and my goal is, as we go through this story, and a lot of it is going to be, it's going to be paraphrasing, if you will, Joseph's complicated, long story, at least for a single sermon. But we are going to pause and to look within Joseph's life and see these 3 things in Joseph's life. My goal tonight is that as you think about the story of Joseph, which I believe most of us within this auditorium are probably familiar with, that when we think of the story of Joseph, we can be encouraged that God promises us we are capable of doing the same type of things. I want to be very clear. I am not in any way, shape, or form endorsing the idea that God is going to give any of us the ability to interpret dreams. That is not what I mean. But what I mean is, as we look at Joseph's life, we're going to see these instances in his life where he suffers despite doing no wrong. We're going to see instances in his life where he is doing well and then faces temptation. And we are going to see situations in Joseph's life where he has the opportunity in situations that we would think that's a good opportunity, and situations where we would think that is not a great opportunity to reach people with the truth about who God is. And so we're going to look at these 3 things, and like I said, we're going to try to fly through the majority of the story of Joseph in a single sermon. And so I hope that you are patient with me and forgiving with me if I skip over some things that you think are of extreme importance in the story of Joseph, or if I miss a detail here or miss a detail there. The beginning of Joseph's life, we find out in Genesis chapter 37, starts when we start the story when he is 17 years old. And we are told, beginning in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 37, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors." Verse 4, "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." Now Joseph, as a young 17-year-old, perhaps as we read chapter 37 or look at chapter 37, we see Joseph perhaps lacking the wisdom to say things in such a way that do not antagonize his siblings. But what we see in Joseph is someone who is not attempting to or not seeking to cause strife. And yet, verse 4, because his brothers recognize that he is the favorite sibling, he is hated. His brothers cannot speak peacefully with him because they know that he is dad's favorite. Small aside, small lesson for parents with multiple children. Don't let any of them know that one of them's the favorite. Pretty simple for me at this moment. Barnabas is my favorite, and so that works. But we see here, he's already in a situation where he is suffering. He is an outcast, and there's no indication that he is doing anything to antagonize his brothers intentionally. But we see, beginning in verse 5, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. We recognize and we see, and we'll see this later in the story of Joseph, that Joseph seems to have this ability to have these dreams that are meaningful dreams, and to be able to, in later chapters, interpret these dreams. But Joseph says, this is because God has allowed me to do this. There's no indication here that Joseph is self-aggrandizing himself. He's not trying to hold himself up to be better than anyone around him. It is simply reporting this dream that he has been given. And because he does it, his brothers hate him all the more. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in a household with siblings, or in my case, a sibling, you were undoubtedly at some point in your life in a situation where you were not happy with your sibling. I am unaware of any children that at all times get along. And if you tell me that your children do, I have to believe that you probably are missing something. Siblings fight. Siblings argue. If we're lucky, it's small arguments or small things, and people will hopefully get over things quickly. But in all my years growing up, I don't believe my younger sister ever once thought about selling me into slavery, which is what ends up happening to Joseph, right? But you look at that, that's the good outcome, right? What was the original plan? If we continue on in Genesis chapter 37, what were they originally going to do? Kill him. I am quite certain, except for maybe a few very brief moments in my sister's life, she never intended to kill me. Quite certain that was never a thing. And yet, Joseph's siblings hated him so much that they sought to kill him. And when one of the siblings goes, that's a little much, maybe we can just stick them here, and then they decide, oh, well, we don't want his blood actually on our hands, we'll just sell him into slavery. And he ends up getting sold into slavery. And again, as I look at that story, and you can go back and you can read this, and you can go through the details, and you can come and tell me that I'm wrong, but I don't see instances in this story in Genesis chapter 37 where Joseph is actively seeking to antagonize his brothers, where he is actively seeking to make their lives more difficult. I see in this story Joseph reporting a dream in which he has been given, recognizing that as we continue on in the story of Joseph, that Joseph associates his dreams and his ability to understand these dreams with a gift that God has given him. Joseph is merely reporting upon the things that God has given him, and he is hated for it, and he suffers for it. As we skip forward just a little bit to Genesis chapter 39, after he has been sold into slavery, those slavers take him down to Egypt, and he is sold in Egypt to a man named Potiphar. And while he is there, we begin to see at the beginning part, if you just kind of go through the first 5 verses, essentially what it tells us is that as a member of the household of Potiphar, as this slave, he is blessed and raises himself to a point where Potiphar says, look, everything's good. You're in control. Right? And everything is going as well as it can be for Joseph's situation. Right? He finds himself in a situation where, yes, he is a slave, but he is a slave in a situation where it's different than the slavery that we think of and associate with our American history. It's a different type of slavery. And here he is in a spot where, yes, he's a slave, but he has been put into a position of authority within that household. And it says that God blessed him and things are going well for him. And this is where I think of, and this is what I thought of when I thought of that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Be careful when you stand and you think you are standing firm, lest you fall. Because here Joseph is in a situation where things are going great. And at this moment, he finds himself in a moment of extreme temptation. Beginning in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 39. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. This is Potiphar. So Potiphar left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. We see while Joseph is at this moment in his life where things are going well for the situation that he finds himself in, a moment in which he faces extreme temptation. And he says, no. And he doesn't give in. What I think is interesting here, and it's something that I don't always focus on or always think about, is this section where it says in verse 10, and as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her. In other words, Potiphar's wife does not just take one shot, tempt Joseph one time, and then move on. But day after day, Joseph has to face this temptation. And we know in the story, and again, because of time, because I want to cover more, we're not going to read every single one of these verses, but we know in the story that there comes a time in which Potiphar's wife becomes even more aggressive with Joseph. And she finds him in a situation where they are alone together. And she again says, "Hey, me and you, let's go." And it gets to the point where he has to turn and flee. He runs away. And as he's running away, she grabs his cloak, right? She grabs his outer garment, and he's left behind. And then she makes these accusations against him and says, "Oh, look what this man has done. He has attacked me." And her husband, believing the word of his wife, is angry. In verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. We see again an instance in Joseph's life where he suffers not because he did wrong, but because he was doing right. In verse 10 of that chapter, what does he say? He says, verse 9, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? In other words, Joseph refuses to give into this temptation because how can I sin against God? And yet, in his rejection of that temptation, he finds himself in a situation where he is thrown in prison and he is suffering, not because of anything that he did wrong, but because he stuck to his understanding of the will of God. In the passage in 1 Peter, it says, if you are suffering because you are a Christian, that it is good for you to celebrate in that, to be okay with that. But do not be okay if you are suffering because you are a thief. You see, the story of Joseph would be a lot less impressive if Joseph is thrown into jail because he messed up, because he gave in to the temptation, because he did what was wrong in the sight of God. But what is impressive about Joseph's story is even though he did what is right, and even though he suffers while doing what is right, he does not reject God. In verse 21 it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." Joseph is faithful to God. I think about that and I think, how easy would it be in that moment to say, you know what, enough is enough. My siblings have conspired to murder me, only to then sell me into slavery. And then while being a slave, I did nothing wrong and found myself in jail. Enough is enough. It would be so easy to go to that, but we don't see that in Joseph. And it is what is encouraging and something for us to try to emulate in our lives, because sometimes, even when we do what is right, we will suffer. Sometimes when we are looked at our places of employment or looked at by our family members who are not believers, and they look at us and they say, "What is wrong with you?" Sometimes it becomes easier to just go with the flow than it is to say, "I'm going to keep doing what I know I should do." Sometimes it's easier to give into that temptation than it is to continue to fight against it. And yet we see in the story of Joseph facing great temptation, he still is faithful to God. In chapter 40 of Genesis, we read about Joseph while he is in prison. Two other individuals are put into prison with him, and they have these dreams, and they are greatly distressed by their dreams. And Joseph, as part of his charge, as part of his kind of what he's doing within that prison, he comes upon them and he finds them in great distress, and he asks them what is wrong. And they say, "We had these dreams, and yet no one is here to interpret these dreams." Beginning in verse 8, they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." When I think about Joseph while he is in prison, I think about that passage in 2 Timothy where Paul tells Timothy to be prepared in season and out of season, to teach and to rebuke. Be prepared to present God. When you find yourselves in situations where you don't think that it's going to work out, and when you find yourself in situations where you expect that chance to come. Not many of us, I don't believe, would, finding ourselves in Joseph's situation, take this opportunity to go, "Is this not from God? Does not interpretation of dreams belong to God? Tell me your dreams." And while he is a prisoner for something that he did not do, while he was accused of doing something bad because he was a slave in a household, because his siblings who had planned on murdering him decided to have mercy on him and sell him into slavery, finds himself in prison and says, "Here's an opportunity to proclaim that the interpretation of these dreams belong to God." And we know in the story, and again, I encourage you, read these texts, study them, come tell me where I'm wrong, if I'm wrong. But we read in here that Joseph interprets these two dreams, And one is a good outcome for the man, and one is a bad outcome for the man. And Joseph's request is what? His request is, please remember me when you are set free. That's it. Simple request. Here we see him in a situation where I think most of us would say probably not the ideal opportunity for preaching. And yet he presents God to these individuals. He does so in the proclamation that these interpretations belong to God. See, Joseph didn't take credit for it. Joseph gave credit to God. At the very beginning of chapter 41, we read that 2 whole years later, Pharaoh has a dream. And when Pharaoh has his dream, and none of the people that the Pharaoh has counted on to be able to help him interpret and understand these dreams, this dream that has been greatly distressing to him, when he comes to that situation, the cupbearer remembers all of a sudden, there was this guy while I was in prison who interpreted my dream, and he told me what was going to happen. 2 years Joseph sat in prison for a crime that he did not commit while he was a slave because his siblings sold him into slavery. For 2 years, he was forgotten about by that man who he had encouraged. And as you look at the rest of chapter 41, we read about Joseph coming and Joseph interpreting these dreams for Pharaoh, explaining to him what is going to take place, and again, giving credit to God. And Joseph finds himself in a situation where, again, he rises to an important role. In fact, he becomes, let's look at verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of the Pharaoh, and he went through all the land of Egypt. And during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt. And he put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around him. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Joseph, because of his plans, because he is blessed by God, because he has an understanding of what it is that God is going to do through this gift that God has given him, comes up with a plan to help the Egyptians out. And by doing so, he sets up the situation for which the dreams that his brothers hated him all the more for are fulfilled. As you continue on in Genesis chapter 42, all the way through well, 45 and 46, really, you see the scenarios in which Joseph's brothers return to him. You see the scenarios in which Joseph's brothers come and they must bow before him. You see the scenarios that Joseph had dreamed about coming true. And we know, as we continue to look at the story and as you continue to think about Joseph's life, you know that Joseph's family moves to Egypt. That there they are greatly blessed by God. And we know that as you approach the end of Genesis and begin to prepare for the Exodus, we know that through a series of events that the Egyptian leadership forgets about the things that Joseph had done for them, and that the Israelites find themselves in slavery. And we have this key moment, though, in the history of the people of God, where Joseph, despite the fact that he is persecuted, by his own family, despite the fact that he is persecuted by the household in which he has been placed, despite the fact that he finds himself in prison and he helps out one of the prisoners and that prisoner forgets about him for 2 years, that Joseph finds himself in a situation where he is able to provide for not only his family but all of the people around him. And it's this key moment, this key fulcrum in the story of the Bible that leads us to Moses and the return to the promised land and all of the rest of the things that we will read about throughout the Old Testament. And when I think about Joseph's life, I think about those passages we looked at. I think about 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. We as Christians should not be surprised or unprepared to suffer for the name of Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. We as Christians need to be careful when we think we stand on solid ground, lest we fall. We need to understand that when we face temptation, that there are ways out of that temptation. And finally, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching. For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but have itching ears that will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. As for you, always be sober-minded. Endure suffering. Do the work of an evangelist and fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have loved his appearing. We as Christians need to be ready in season and out of season. Ready for the opportunities to present God to those who do not know God. Prepared to be surprised. Prepared to tell the person you don't think needs to or wants to hear about God to tell them about God. I hope in this short lesson I have connected these somewhat disjointed verses in such a way that will allow you to remember them when you think about the story of Joseph. And that you will be encouraged when you think about that story of Joseph to understand that you will face suffering for your faith. To understand that you will face temptation, and yet you do not have to give in to it. To understand that you need to be ready in season and out of season to share the love of God with others. If there's anything we can do as a congregation this evening to encourage you, to help you through times of suffering, to help you find escapes from temptation, to provide you the tools that you need in order to present God to those who come into your life. If we can do anything to help you, we invite you to come.